Hi everybody, this is Eric from DocuData. I'm just going to show you how to install and configure Pervasive 10 Workgroup to be used with EDC. I'm not going to actually do the install here. I've pre-installed the Workgroup on this machine ahead of time because it takes a while to install and it would just waste your time. But the only thing to know is when you install it, the installer will ask you if you want to install it as a service or as an application. You always want to install it as a service, especially on the server, because if the server has to reboot for any reason, when it's installed as a service, you don't need to have someone logged onto the machine for Pervasive to start, as opposed to if it's installed as an application and the server reboots. If nobody logs onto the machine, Pervasive won't start, and then EDC won't be able to start either. So you don't want that. So you always install it as a service. Also, if you don't have the license key ahead of time, Pervasive will install a trial key for you. So that's alright. But in the future, when you want to put your real license in there, you go to Start in the Pervasive program group. In Utilities, there's something called a License Administrator. So you just paste your license key in here and you apply. Also, when you're installing the Workgroup, it's always better to set the gateway locator, as they call it. The gateway locator is just a setting that will make Pervasive and EDC know which machine acts as the server at all times. In general, this is not a problem with EDC because we install services also on the server, and because of that, the gateway is always the server, because it's whoever starts EDC first that will act as the server. But because we have services installed on the server, usually the gateway always comes back to the server anyway. But I've seen situations where, for some other reasons, this didn't work, and there was a problem with that. So might as well set the gateway locator when you install it. It just takes a few seconds. And to do that, you go into Start, same place again, Utilities, but you got the gateway locator program. So you go here. On this machine, I've set it already to my server name, but when you open this up for the first time, it will be stating unassigned in here. So you just need to go and change to your server name or your IP address for the server, whichever. You also want to do that when you install workstations. You want to make sure the workstations are pointing to the server, meaning all the installations you do for the workgroup in your organization on your network, they always have to point to the same place. It has to point to the server, whichever machine acts as your server. And that takes care of installing Pervasive as such. Now once it's installed, there's a few settings to change to make it run a bit better with EDC. The default settings are pretty good, but a few tweaks will make it even better. So these are changed in the control center. Okay, there's two places to change the settings in. There's the what they call the engine part and the local client part. Here, this is my server engine, so I just right click on this and go Properties. On the left here, I got all the available menus with options to change. We're going to go from the top one by one. In here, this is just information, so there's nothing to change here. On the access part, the only thing I would change is the client stored credential, because EDC doesn't make any use of this, and it might also prevent some permission errors coming up in the future, so it's better to take it off. Communication protocol, You just want to make sure that enable auto reconnect is on and that only TCP IP is selected here, because EDC doesn't make use of the other protocols anyway. Compatibility, we leave it to 9.5. Data integrity, there's nothing to change in here. The settings are good as they are. Debugging, again, nothing to change. Always make sure, if by mistake someone turns this on, this will create problems. So you always make sure this is off at all times. Directories, we change nothing in here. Now these last two menu options depend a bit on how much memory I got on your server, and also if the server is used only for database use. The Pervasive help explains a little bit what all these settings mean, but in EDC in general, we take the system cache off, because this system cache setting is relating to Windows cache, and Pervasive itself has its own cache mechanism, which is more performant than using the Windows cache. So in general, we take this off. And in the performance tuning, then the limit segment size to 2 GB, we take this off also. This was an old compatibility settings for older OS like Windows 98, but we don't use that anymore. In here, the only two settings that matter is the cache allocation size and the max microkernel memory usage. These go hand in hand, and they also depend on that other memory usage setting, the system cache. In general, when you take this off, like we've done here, you want to make sure you got a value in here. Now what these two value means, Pervasive do most of its work inside of this cache. So ideally you want to put this number to the greatest number possible without compromising your server. So for example, if you got a server with 2 GB of RAM and you only use it for EDC, you could easily put that to 1 GB. That means you will be left with 1 GB for the remaining of the system. And what this setting means is that the 1 GB you have left available, Pervasive will only use that cache. This is they call it level 2 cache, and this is level 1 cache. So let's say you have filled up your level 1 cache with 1 GB, and Windows itself, let's say, takes about, just for example, 256 megabytes of RAM on its own to run. That means you got about 750 megabytes left on your system. What this setting means is that at 60% here, because this is a percentage, that means that after EDC has filled up its level 1 cache to 1 gig, Pervasive won't use more than 60% of the remaining available memory you have on your system. So in this case here, if I only have 750 megabytes left on my machine, that means that at most Pervasive won't use more than 60% of that 750 megabytes. So it will always leave some memory available to the system, and that's a good thing, because otherwise if it would want to just use everything it can, then your machine wouldn't have any memory left for the system to run, and the server would crash. So 60% is a pretty good value. Well, like I said, you could tweak that depending on how your machine is used and how much memory you have on your system. But in general, I could put that easily to at least half of what I got for my memory on the server. And you leave this to 60%, it's pretty good for a start. You can always tweak later on if you find that EDC is not performant enough.